Good morning, Magic. I'm Gavin Verhey from Wizards of the Coast, and I was actually inspired to make today's video after being sent some very cool stuff from Rocklove. They make amazing magic jewelry and wanted to show it off to you today first. First up is Commander Sphere, and I absolutely love Rocklove and I love what they've done, so I'm excited to check this one out, see what we got. I know you want to see the Commander Sphere, but hold on just a second with the artwork of the card. On the back side, it says what number it is. So there's only 500 of these made. This is number 4 of 500, so that's pretty cool. So here it is, the Commander Sphere in all its glory. It's so cool. You get this at the very bottom here, if you can see it, you get number 4 of 500 actually etched onto it. Here we've got Arcane Signet. This one is a personal favorite of mine. Let's see how it turned out. Check out this Arcane Signet. That is so cool. And one neat thing about this is that some of the blue actually glows in the dark. So that's pretty sweet. Actually, let's give that a test. I turned off all the lights here, and you know, it's still a little light out. It is good morning magic after all, but you can still see. Check that out. It's glowing a little bit. This would look so cool. Modern players, this one is for you. We've got Mishra's Bauble hanging out, just like the card. You even get the little Phyrexian mask right there. Oh, that's pretty awesome. Here's one that actually modern players and Commander players can get around together. This is Urza's Saga. Just that amazing piece of art rendered as a piece of jewelry. And that brings me to the newest one here, Mox Amber. In fact, it's not even out yet. This is an early version. They'll be shipping in April from Rocklove. There's only gonna be 1,000 of these out there. And this is like an actual one-of-a-kind, 16 to 40 million years old amber specimens. This is real amber in here. It's actually a Mox Amber, which is so flippin' cool. And this one, seeing this, will inspire me to make a video today for you. Now, Arcane Signet, I actually already have a whole video on, talking about if it's a mistake or not. And if you haven't seen it, you should go check it out. And Urza's Saga, I also have a video on talking about the creation of that card. Mishra's Bauble and Commander Sphere, less so. Maybe I'll make one in the future. But today, what I really wanted to focus on was this, Mox Amber and all about Moxes. Let's get to it. In the early 1990s, Magic the Gathering was being concepted out. The first playtest cards were given out and circulated starting at the University of Pennsylvania. These cards were little more than white pieces of paper with text and clip art or simple illustrations. But as the game grew and it went on its way from playtesting to reality, that clip art, well, it wasn't going to fly. The game was going to need illustrations. The way it worked in the beginning was simple. There weren't art briefs or descriptions. You just got the name and painted the card. Enter artist Dan Frazier. He recaps the moment he got his assignment in this interview from the YouTube channel Original Magic Art.
Okay, you want me to do this card? Here's the names of the cards we're gonna do. Okay, animate dead. Okay, what are these? The Mox Ruby, the Mox Sapphire, the Mox Jet, the Mox Pearl. Okay, I got the Ruby's Mox. What's the Mox? They said, we don't know.
It was Dan's job to bring a piece of Mox jewelry, whatever that was, to life. And so he did. Mox Pearl, Mox Sapphire, Mox Jet, Mox Ruby, Mox Emerald. Dan didn't know it at the time, but these would become 5 of the most sought-after powerful cards in all of Magic to this day. They're iconic cards, and fortunately, they were created that way. In an interview with Dan from BigAir.com, he said, "The Moxes did what I was asked to do. You could recognize a Mox from across the room. I can hold one 50 feet away and you'll go like, that's a Mox. It's simple. It can be viewed upside down. It's an icon. It's like a stop sign. It's not beautiful. It works." That shape language and style is so powerful. Even recently with the Secret Lair signets that pay homage to these Moxen, just seeing one set in the frame in a remotely similar way, the mind draws the connection back to the original inspiration. I remember when I learned how the originals were made, and it blew my mind. And most people probably don't know this fun little fact.
Took a piece of marbled paper and glued it to an illustration board with Liquitex, a matte medium. And then I took the okayed drawing of the Mox, a Xerox of it, and cut it out and glued that down with polymer medium onto the board. And
Those are all.
Then I do an oil glaze on top of that,
That Volkenberger did.
and
no
so
actual cards for
that
it.
was the Mox.
Yes, you heard that right. The original Mox artwork was literally glued together. Wild. There's so many stories of people trading Moxes straight up for basic lands. After all, why would you want a basic land that's an artifact? But people quickly learned what we know now. The Moxes are incredibly powerful. Because you can play as many as you want for 0 mana, they are essentially a bonus-free land drop powering out your spells. And as part of the Power 9, they sit alongside Black Lotus, Ancestral Recall, Time Walk, and Time Twister as some of the most powerful cards ever printed. These were the first, but not the last. There are 13 Moxes in Magic history. And I would argue that the hallmark trait of a Mox is something even more dangerous than a Lotus. While yes, Black Lotus did cost 0 to cast, the legacy of Lotuses has moved into Lotus's thing being making lots of mana and having a mana cost to do so, like Ungilded or Timeless Lotus. On the other hand, the trait of a Mox is that it only makes 1 mana, but they all cost 0. A 0 mana cost mana source is incredibly hard to get right and walk a thin line between busted and unplayable. How did we do? Let's take a look. After the originals, the next Mox was originally slated to be in 1996's Mirage, a colorless Mox where you could only have one in play at a time, called Mox Crystal, or Crystalline Mox. Remember this card? Well, of course you don't. They realized it was still really powerful and scrapped the idea. A problem though was that they had already commissioned art from Dan Frazier, so they took that artwork and made Enlightened Tutor with it instead. Note the crystal she's holding and the mana stones in her crown. Fun little fact for you there. But it was in March 1998, 5 years after the game's release, that we actually would get another Mox and another piece by Dan Frazier in the Stronghold set, Mox Diamond. It tapped for any color, but had the sizable drawback of forcing you to discard a land. This way, you were trading off resources for fast mana. This was at least a bit more fair. You had to go down an additional card to play it. But in a deck that doesn't mind making that trade-off, well, it still was extremely powerful. By November of that year, Urza Saga was out, and with its array of powerful artifact synergies, Mox Diamond catapulted to a first place finish and extended at Pro Tour Rome 1998 in the hands of Finnish Magic great Tomi Hovi. When you're using spells like Windfall and Time Spiral to refill your hand, and have cards like Tolarian Academy that actively want you to have more artifacts on the battlefield, Mox Diamond quickly becomes a busted piece. But even once Urza's mess was cleaned up, the card still saw play. In Standard, some used it to accelerate out Oath of Druids, which could cheat cards like, I'm not joking here, Thorn Elemental onto the battlefield, or speed up combos like Dirk Babarowski's Abducted Drake combo deck, where you got Iridescent Drake into play with an abduction in your graveyard and an Altar of Dementia on the battlefield. Sacrifice the Drake, it comes back thanks to abduction, then brings back the abduction, repeat, and voila, a decked opponent. It did eventually get banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage in 1999 as some things were getting cleaned up until 2004 when it was unbanned. And when I started playing older formats in the mid-2000s, the card was still relevant but reasonable, powering some land-heavy strategies but far from ubiquitous. Even today in cubes, this is a nice card that some decks want and others don't. I have to say that I appreciate Mox Diamond. The second take on the Moxes was strong in some decks, but not busted everywhere. Nice going, design team. In August of 1998, we'd actually get another Mox, though not one people played in tournaments. Jack in the Mox. This would appear in Unglued, Magic's first ever joke set, and paving the way for many goofy Moxes in the future. It charms me that Dan Frazier illustrated this one too. This card is still really strong, by the way, though of course it really stings when you roll the 1. Anyway, it would be another 5 years until we saw a Mox, with Chrome Mox in Mirrodin. This was the chase card in the set, both because of the name Mox and also because of power. It was like Mox Diamond, except instead of discarding a land, you could imprint a non-land, non-artifact card. And this is so much more flexible than Mox Diamond. Consider a hand with 2 lands and a Mox Diamond. With that hand, the Mox Diamond gives you a first turn accelerant, but it takes away a mana source you're going to use later, which means it only speeds you ahead for a temporary amount of time. Conversely, with Chrome Mox, it gives you the mana boost without taking away a land. This card was quite powerful, seeing play in both standard, extended, and beyond. And unlike Mox Diamond, it's a card that even some control decks used to speed up by a turn and help fight back against quick aggro draws. It let you get to a board sweeper a turn earlier, and the power of card draw spells like Thirst for Knowledge made sure you always had cards, or could even discard the Mox later in the game. While it's never been legal in Modern, it was banned when the format was announced, I have to say that against all odds, somehow this Mox also turned out excellent. It was exciting, saw a lot of play, but wasn't ubiquitous or broken. Really nice job on this one. Up next is another goofy one from the next unset, Mox Lotus. While I am counting this, I have to say this is really far more of a Lotus than a Mox. It doesn't really obey the rules of Moxen. While it is more of a Mox than Flamoxed Cyclops, if you want to learn more about Mox Lotus, I suggest watching my video all about Black Lotus, where I cover this one in a bit more detail. So let's skip right past that goofball and on to, well, another goofball, but probably not a card you've ever heard of. Okay, so around 2007, Wizards was working on this website called Gleemax. More or less, the idea is it would be a social media platform for gamers. There was an advertising push around it. As part of the advertising push, on Magic Online, you could be awarded the card Gleemox. This card only exists on Magic Online. It's a Mox, but it triumphantly proclaims that it's banned on the card. I'd call that downside text, yeah. Still, it's a neat footnote to me because this is another piece of Dan Frazier art and it only exists here. Wild. And as for Gleemax, yeah, it didn't work out. Maybe it was just ahead of its time. Let's finally get back into the land of Moxen you can actually put into a deck with another Mirrodin set. 7 years had passed between the last tournament legal Mox from one Mirrodin to another with Scars of Mirrodin. Did I mention these are really hard to design appropriate cards for? Using the new Metalcraft ability, it brought us Mox Opal, a Mox which only worked if you had 3 artifacts. Notably, this one is legendary as well, helping to curb its power and also making sure drawing 3 doesn't automatically turn itself on. This saw some standard play, though mostly once Caw-Blade came on the scene with Mirrodin Besieged, that stole the focus away from any clever artifact decks. But in older formats, this was a smash hit. The wider the card pool gets, the more cheap artifacts there are to turn this on faster, artifact lands included. In Eternal formats, this slotted right into affinity decks, giving them what was essentially just a Mox, a huge boost to that archetype. But it wasn't just affinity. Over years and years, artifact decks in Modern became propped up by the Opal, whether Lantern Control or Ironworks-based decks, and on January 13th, 2020, 10 years after its initial release, Mox Opal was banned in the Modern format. What do I think of Mox Opal? Personally, I like this one a lot less than a card like Chrome Mox. The problem I have is that it's so polar. Either you're playing a ton of artifacts, in which case it's mostly a Mox, or you aren't and it's unplayable. Encouraging decks with lots of cheap artifacts is dangerous because they have historically been problematic. Additionally, if you are playing a deck with all of these artifacts, then you want to draw this card every game, so you're going to play 4 copies. But because of the legendary rule, you are likely to draw multiples of a card that isn't going to die naturally like a creature, though you can admittedly use one as a one-shot mana boost by tapping a Mox, playing a new one, and sacrificing the old Mox. It's a bit high variance of a design. Compare all of this to Chrome Mox, which can go in a wide variety of decks and has a lot of interesting choices to make about when to include it and when to play it. There's a huge difference. Now, I don't hate Mox Opal or anything. I think it's a fine attempt from the Scars of Mirrodin team and got players really excited. But I definitely took away from it that I enjoy these hyperlinear Moxes a lot less. This brings us to our next Mox, which is an interesting counterexample to Mox Opal. Appearing in Dominaria in 2018, a whopping 8 years after the last one, Mox Amber adds a mana that's the color of any legendary creature or planeswalker you control. This is a really interesting one to me, especially in comparison to Mox Opal. Whereas the Opal encouraged a very linear strategy, focusing on a bunch of cheap artifacts, this one is very open-ended. You need a legend, but it could be any legend in your colors. Mini legends are more expensive to cast, so it's more likely to ramp you in the mid-game as opposed to in the first few turns. This card got a lot of people talking and trying it, but ultimately was only good in very specific decks. Aside from a combo deck using it, involving Kethis the Hidden Hand and Diligent Excavator, where the legendary was actually upside, it didn't see a ton of play. In Commander, it sees play in a modest 4% of decks, according to EDHREC, which seems pretty reasonable and is good with cheap commanders. I think Mox Amber was a good attempt, even if it mostly missed. It was exciting to read, and people tried it out. The margin on the strength of these cards is razor thin. Even if it had been slightly different to, for example, simply work if you controlled another legendary permanent, it would combo with legendary lands in a huge way. For the goals of the card and set, I think this card did a good job. And that brings us into our last, or second to last, depending on how you want to count it, Mox. Modern Horizons Mox Tantalite. This is sort of a callback to Lotus Bloom. If you had to wait 3 turns for your Mox, how good would it be? Well, the answer is not very. This one was more or less a whiff. Now, once again, I think it's worth stating that these are extremely hard to design and get right, so there's just as equally a world where we made a Mox in this set and it was totally bananas. We were probably right to be conservative here. That said, this is, to me, our least successful of the constructed legal Moxes. It's exciting to read, but once you figure out that 3 turns is too long to wait to get this into play, that obviates it from most decks. Compare this one with Mox Amber. Mox Amber was exciting to read, and while it didn't see a ton of play, it inspired people to try it and think that their deck could be a place it would be good, instead of just a flat 3-turn cost that if it's too slow for a format, it's just not going to see play. Now there is one more Mox I'm going to mention. Well, sort of a Mox. Recently, at the Unknown event in Philadelphia, I gave people special playtest cards they could put into their limited decks. I made a whole video showing off all the cards. You can go check it out. One of those cards, Mox Poison. A Mox reference, this one gives you mana at the cost of 2 poison counters per use. We wouldn't actually make this card because against most decks, it's just a 4-use Mox unless you play against poison. But in this limited environment, it was a fun one to talk about. So what do I think about all the Mox variants from a design, not a power level, perspective? Well, if I was to rank the 5 non-joke ones from a design perspective, I think I'd go as follows. Number 5 is Mox Tantalite. While an exciting read, it was a big miss for a card name with so much cachet. Number 4 is Opal. It's one of the most powerful, for sure, but don't get power wrapped into design success. It's just too polar. Number 3 is Mox Amber. While this ended up on the weak side, I love how it plays into the set themes, encourages you to try and make it work with legends, and gives you a boost later instead of on turn 1 or 2. It's close to number 2 for me actually, but I have to give number 2 to Mox Diamond. This one is impressive. Wizards' second printed Mox is an exciting card which ended up strong, but reasonable. I don't love how sometimes you mana screw yourself with this, but hey, the cost of playing a Mox. And that means my number 1 design favorite is Chrome Mox. It creates so many interesting decisions, can be played in a variety of decks, and even uses the set mechanic in an exciting way. Nice job, Mirrodin design team. That's my ranking, but what's yours? Let me know in the comments down below. Over Magic's 30 years, Moxes have wore many faces. For the Vintage Championships, a special event where the player wins an oversized card and its new artwork, the original Moxes have been re-envisioned. Whether with Vulcan Baga Cycle, also appearing in Vintage Masters on Magic Online, Raoul Vital's 5 Moxes for the championship with takes most of you have probably never seen, or the cadre of incredible artists who have done them most recently for these championships, Siddharth Chaturvedi, Tyler Walpole, Philip Berberan, Eric Wilkerson, and Gerald Threat, they're all stunning. Truly an amazing prize to own. As incredible as all of these pieces are though, nothing to me feels as Magic iconic burned into my brain as Dan's 5 original pieces. Marbled paper glued to an illustration of jewelry. In Dan's own words, an icon, like a stop sign, of magic. I hope you enjoyed this look into the Moxes, and big thanks to Rocklove for sending me this incredibly gorgeous Mox Amber to check out and inspire this video. Let me know in the comments down below what cards you'd love to see me do a deep dive on next. I'll talk with you again soon, and until then, may you draw your Mox on turn 1. You got this. Wildly enough, it's with Time Spiral Remastered, 15 years later in 2021. We brought back the bonus sheet, this time putting cards which had never been in the old frame into the old retro frame. It was an absolute smash success, as people got cards like Thoughtseize and